Penguin Random House Audio presents Song of a Captive Bird by JASMIN DARZNIK. Read for you by Mozhan Marnò. For Kian and Sean. Remember its flight, for the bird is mortal. Forugh Farrokhzad, Iranian poet, 1935 to 1967. Inspired by the life and poetry of Forugh Farrokhzad. Part 1. I feel sorry for the garden. 1. There's a street where the boys who were once in love with me, the boys with tousled hair and lanky legs, still think about the innocent girl who was carried away by the wind one night. From Reborn. It was the end of my girlhood, though I didn't know it yet. If I'd realized what would happen there, would I have followed my mother into that room in the bottom of the city? If I'd guessed the purpose of our visit, would I have turned to run before my mother struck the brass knocker against the door? I doubt it. I was 16 years old, and by anyone's account already a troublemaker. But in those moments that my sister and I stood under the clear blue sky of Tehran's winter, I understood nothing about what would soon happen to me, and I was much too frightened to break free. My mother's sister and I had set out from the house in the morning, wearing veils. This was strange and should have given me pause. My sister and I never wore veils, and the only time my mother veiled herself was at home when she prayed. She had a light cotton veil, white with pale pink rosebuds, she wore for her prayers. The garments she handed my sister Puran and me that day were altogether different. Black, heavy chadors I usually only saw old women wear. "Put them on," she ordered. We must be visiting a shrine to atone for my sins. This was the only explanation I could think of for why my mother insisted we cover ourselves up. I pulled the chador over my head and then stood studying my reflection. The girl in the mirror was thin, with pale skin and thick bangs that refused to lie flat under the veil. I watched as Puran drew the garment over her head. She looked tiny with her body draped in the fabric and only a triangle open for her face. There were dark half-moons of sleeplessness under her eyes, and just beneath her left eye, a bruise. So she's been punished too, I thought. "Don't step in the jube," my mother called out as my sister and I jumped clear of the icy waterways that ran down the center of the street. A few blocks from the house, we passed the first of many hawkers and peddlers. His 2 sway-backed donkeys were laden with pomegranates, melons, eggplants, and an assortment of crockery and cooking tools. When we neared Avenue Pahlavi, my mother hailed a droshky, a small horse-drawn buggy topped with a black canopy. We made a tight fit, the 3 of us, pressed together in the back seat. My mother drew her veil across her face, then leaned forward to speak to the driver. He looked at her curiously. "Are you sure you want to go there?" I heard him say. He looked very uncomfortable. "Begging your pardon, but it's no place for ladies such as yourself." My mother said something I couldn't hear. The driver tightened his necktie with one hand, took up his whip with the other, and with that the horse lurched into the street. "Where are we going?" I whispered, nudging my sister gently a few times, but she wouldn't look at me. She just sank back farther into her seat, staring miserably at her hands. It was morning just after 10 o'clock, and the streets were crowded with people, many of them women on their way to the bazaar for the day's provisions. At the bakery, the line snaked around the building and into an alleyway. Men carried trays of flatbread on their heads. A boy hustled down the street with 2 huge earthenware jugs. We traveled in silence, turning off from the main thoroughfare and onto a street I didn't recognize. The wheels of the droshky creaked and groaned, and all the landmarks I knew disappeared until nothing was familiar. After perhaps another mile or so, we eventually passed a railway station. Here the sharp clap of the horse's hooves against the concrete gave way to the soft thud of packed dirt. which was how I knew we were now in the southern section of Tehran, the city's poorest district. The streets turned shabby, and each corner we passed, each mosque, each row of houses and shops seemed dingier than the one before. Whole families crowded around dung fires, rubbing their hands over the flames to keep warm. At the doors of a mosque, mothers stood with babies strapped to their chests, begging for alms as their children played at their skirts. Men slumped along the walls of the houses, while older children milled about barefoot in the streets. Beggars, puddles, rubbish, stray dogs, I couldn't tear my eyes from any of it. Nobody I knew ever came here. I wanted to see everything. I wanted to understand. "Tss," my mother hissed. "Don't stare like that." She tugged at me and pulled me back. At an intersection, we came to an abrupt halt while a man led 2 donkeys through the street. All the houses had mud walls and sloping tin rooftops, and the roads were rutted with bumps. This area was called the bottom of the city, but it wasn't until much later that I'd learned that name. "Are you sure you'll be all right, madam?" said the driver when the buggy jerked to a stop. My mother seemed nervous, but she nodded and quietly handed him the fare. As I stepped from the coach and into the lane, a strange odor assailed me, a mixture of mud, manure, and smoke. All at once I felt clammy and weak-kneed, and I reached for my sister's elbow to steady myself. From the end of an alley came the sharp barking of dogs, and black plumes rose from the rooftops, smudging the bright January sky. I followed my mother and sister a few paces, then stopped and planted my hands on my waist. "Why are we here? Where are we going?" I asked. "It's a clinic," my mother answered. She spoke quietly, and now she, too, avoided my eyes. "For God's sake, just hurry up." I was still confused, but I relaxed a little. The pain in my arm had worsened in the night, and my lower lip was swollen and throbbing. I'd be grateful for some pills to ease the soreness. I gathered my veil around me, clasped it more tightly under my chin, and then followed my mother and sister down the lane. When we reached the last building, my mother gripped the edge of her veil with her teeth to free her hands and reached for the brass knocker. She banged on the door. She banged again. After a moment, it opened a crack. The vestibule was full of women. They stood in pairs and in groups, older women and several very young ones, from one end of the wall to the other. They waited with their heads tipped down, biting their lips and staring at the floor. No one spoke. A worn, faded carpet had been strung up from the ceiling as a makeshift partition between the vestibule and the rest of the building. After some minutes, a girl of 16 or 17 drew back the carpet and led us down the corridor and into a cramped chamber lit by 2 small kerosene lamps. The air inside was laced with a strong, bitter scent. Ammonia, I guessed. I squinted and scanned the room. There was a square window set high up in the wall and barred with a metal grate. Against one wall stood a table draped with a white cotton sheet. I glimpsed a wash basin in the farthest corner, etched with brown lines. The walls were bare, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw that on one side of the room a crack reached from the floor to the ceiling in a single, long, jagged line. I glanced at my sister, but she still wouldn't meet my eyes. Was it then, in that moment, that I began to understand why we'd come to this place? Or rather, why I had been brought here? Perhaps, but by this time it was already too late. The door opened and a stout older woman entered. She had a sharp chin and she wore her hair parted in the middle and pulled into a low bun. She shut the door, issued a quick greeting, and looked from me to my sister and then to our mother. "Which one?" she asked. My mother nodded in my direction. I watched helplessly as my mother and sister were ushered away. The younger woman stayed behind, standing with her arms clasped together in front of her. "Sit," the older woman ordered once they'd left, motioning to the table. I obeyed. "Take off your underpants and then lie down," she said. With my mother and sister gone, her voice was suddenly harsh. "My underpants?" She nodded. I shook my head. "I won't." The two
Sample complete. Ready to continue?